a merger of that with the traditional African religion of most of the African Jamaican religion that many or most people of African descent subscribed to during slavery, which was Mayalism. If we were to describe Bogle's spirituality, what he had faith in, it would be a combination of that and what we later call revivalism. And there are two kinds, 60 and 61. 60 being Zion and 61 being Poco. And before I go further, to say that revivalism is very much alive in Jamaica today, and it is something to behold, and we really need to know more about that. It has played a very significant role in the development of spirituality and aestheticism, notions of beauty, how we decorate things, but also in relation to dance and music, including popular Jamaican music. And of course, I learned a year ago more definitively that really revival played a very important foundation of Rastafari in Jamaica, especially the early period of Rastafari. Bogle opened a chapel in Stony Gut in 1864. The ceremony for this opening of this chapel, at it, the guest speaker was an African-American preacher by the name of Reverend Richard Warren. He was the guest speaker in Stony Gut at the opening of Bogle's chapel. Bogle was a preacher, well known throughout St. Thomas. He would occasionally go to Kingston, Spanish Town, and in fact, there's one report which suggests that he went even further than that with his preaching. But he was clearly known throughout St. Thomas. The chapel was opened by Reverend Richard Warren, an African American. In fact, I need to say that several African Americans came to Jamaica during the 19th century because if you remember, slavery ended in 1838 in Jamaica, and it was not until the 1860s that slavery was abolished in the United States. And in fact, some quite prominent black abolitionists visited Jamaica before slavery was abolished in the United States. Indeed, some of these black abolitionists were involved in the celebration of August 1 in America. August 1 in the United States was a very important day for African Americans still in enslavement. And African Americans in enslavement used to celebrate, used to mark August 1 to mark the emancipation of blacks in Jamaica and throughout the British Caribbean. Persons who have come to Jamaica, and one of them, which I'll note, is a man by the name of John Willis Maynard. Maynard was a very prominent black abolitionist in the United States. And in fact, before he came to Jamaica, he was a clerk on Capitol Hill, working under the Abraham Lincoln administration. In fact, I've read where Abraham Lincoln, in the administration, they sent him to Central America, to Honduras, to find out the possibility of land to send African Americans to. Because in fact, Abraham Lincoln blamed African Americans for the Civil War in the United States. And what they wanted to do, that to end conflicts amongst white, it would be best if blacks were sent out of the United States. And in fact, Maynard was one of those who was sent to Central America to look at the feasibility of that kind of policy formation that was emerging in the United States. It was somewhere around that time that I detected in the Jamaican newspapers letters by Maynard to the Jamaican press. In 1865, January, February, and so on, there were several letters in the Jamaican press about one, for example, the Sentinel published several articles by Maynard on the popular education. In fact, if you should read those letters to the editor, they are very much relevant today as they were then. In fact, criticizing, first of all, the philosophy of education at the time, which he felt was rooted in prejudice, rooted in racial prejudices. And in fact, that's one of his criticism. The second criticism was that sufficient persons were not in the education system. Sufficient black persons were not in the system, were not being educated formally. And in fact, he advocated what he called popular education. Not just education for black children, but education for black people on a whole. And that education should be technical education. It should be education that tells about the history of blacks. And it should be an education that help persons not just to use their hands as the Sterling report and education would have focused on during that time, but an education in which black people become agency of their own life, become sovereign beings, if you will, become sovereign educators. In fact, during the suppression of the Morant Bay Rebellion, Maynard was arrested and he was placed in a camp, taken to Upper Camp in Kingston, and he was not allowed to see his wife at the time, who was living in Jamaica, and had a child while he was in detention. And in fact, afterwards, he was sent out of the country. He went to New Orleans, and in fact, in 1868, there was a vacant seat in the Congress, the American Congress, and he ran for that seat in 1868, and he won. But the Congress passed a resolution said that they were not ready for a black person to sit. He was offered half of his congressional salary, but he was not permitted to sit in Congress, save for one time in which he was invited to address Congress to say why he should have the seat. But he was not permitted to, other than that, was not permitted to sit in Congress. John Willis Maynard, why my talk about him was because he was intimately related to the movement in St. Thomas in the East and its neighboring parish called St. David, which is now a part of St. Thomas. In fact, he was closely allied to relatives and in-laws of Paulbogle, attending meetings there. In fact, his views on education was indeed the views of his associates in St. Thomas in the East. And his very close friend, Samuel Clark, whose brother married Bogle's daughter, Samuel Clark, he was staying at Clark's house. And in fact, Clark was the one who was executed. Menard founded an organization called the Working Men's Literary Society of St. David. And in that was a debating organization. And in that organization, they discussed several philosophical matters having to do with politics and the relationship with power and the role that blacks would command in that. So he was a very important figure and should be seen as part of that ethos, that radical black tradition that emerged from slavery, that was in slavery and which Taki was a part of, but emerged after that in the form in emancipation. Another African American that was in Jamaica, in fact he was here in the 1850s, probably the most prominent black abolitionist after Frederick Douglass was Henry Highland Garnet. And Garnet spent about 5 years in Jamaica, in Westmoreland. Exceedingly popular. His works are available, his writings. A very radical person, highly regarded. Another one who was highly regarded as well and found himself in Jamaica was Samuel Ringgold Ward. Samuel Ward escaped from slavery in the South and eventually reached Canada. Toured Britain, was a very active abolitionist, highly regarded, and he came to Jamaica. Well, guess what? In Jamaica, he found himself on the side of the planters, and in fact, really spoke ill will about Paulbogle. He was operating in St. Thomas in the east, and had serious conflict with the radical black population in that parish. In fact, he died in Jamaica. He's buried here. He had children here and so on. Now, Paulbogle is known in St. Thomas as General Bogle, which was one of the titles given to him. Or he gave himself, and certainly his organization gave to him, especially during the military phase of the operation in St. Thomas in the east. He was also called Lord Bogle, and he was also called King Bogle. And this shows the highest esteem in which he was held in that parish. In fact, one could easily argue, and it was that without Paulbogle, it would have been unlikely that George William Gordon would have been a member of the Assembly, member of the Jamaican Parliament at the time. He represented, he was one of the members of Parliament from St. Thomas in the East, although he was a man from living in St. Andrew. But persons like Paulbogle and his influence campaigned for him to win his seat in St. Thomas, and indeed he won there. As a result of that, there were not many people in Jamaica who had the right to vote at the time. Just a few thousand, really a few. In fact, less than 4,000, less than 3,000 had the right to vote, and therefore it says something for Bogle's quality. It says something for his influence, because the persons that would have been voting in the election, certainly his focus would have been on blacks and browns. They would have been persons with certain means, because you cannot vote without a certain level of the tax that you pay, as well as income and so on, and ownership of property, especially land and so on. So that he was a man of means, but he had to campaign among people of means to convince them to vote for George William Gordon. Not that the blacks generally, including those who didn't have the right to vote, as Dr. Wilmot, Sweden Wilmot, who has written extensively on this, pointed out. But masses of ordinary blacks, men and women, were in that process, whether they were in it formally or not. they were part of that campaign, and George William Gordon had his seats, I think, primarily because of persons, primarily because, first of all, of Bogle's leadership, and they were on that wavelength. They communicated, they were business partners, and so on and so forth. So that Bogle was responsible for George William Gordon's seat in the Jamaican Assembly. So he was quite influential. He would send his emissaries from Stony Gut to different parts of St. Thomas and call the youths, young men in different districts, and they would come. This is a mark of the influence of this man. They would come down to Stony Gut for his counsel. Clearly, Bogle was a serious political activist in the radical black tradition of Jamaican politics. So was Samuel Clark. In fact, Samuel Clark, whose brother married to Bogle's daughter, was the principal power broker, political power broker in St. David's, the neighboring parish. And in fact, that is precisely because of his influence that they executed him for things that he did not do. So that he called a damn red lie, this letter purporting to be coming from the Queen, which really came from the British government, of course, respecting the petition signed by persons earlier about the conditions to organize by especially the non-conformist churches in Jamaica. So he was executed because of his very important role as a power broker in the politics of St. David. In fact, one could argue, and if you should read Sweden Wilmot's work, you get more on the role of a person like Samuel Clark. But I mean, a politics that involves some level of coercion as well in campaigning. Stones, and in fact, it was in St. David that some persons involved in campaign, one or two, were killed in election campaign in the early 1860s. So we have to understand what was happening at the time. Ideologically, if we could look at some of the ideas coming out of that tradition to which Bogle was a part, certainly the principal slogan of the Morant Bay Rebellion was color for color, skin for skin. A slogan that was adopted by the early Rastafarians in Trinityville, where the first Rastafarian commune developed under Leonard Howell's guidance in the very early period, early 30s of Rastafari in Jamaica. Another slogan of the Morant Bay Rebellion was Black Man Time. That was a slogan of the Morant Bay Rebellion, Black Man Time. Another slogan of the Morant Bay Rebellion was Lion. In fact, all three slogans, Lion, Black Man Time, color for color, skin for skin, was adopted by the early Rastafarians, who were largely Kumina practitioners in Trinityville in St. Thomas, before they were driven out by the colonial police and they went to Pinnacle in St. Catherine. And then in 1954, Pinnacle was broken up by the colonial police again. So that we see a sort of a continuum in some of the ideas of persons from that tradition coming down even to this time. Bogle was of the view that blacks should clave to blacks and clave from white. And so when for example, about 13 or so police officers were sent, constables were sent into Stony Gut to arrest Bogle on the eve of the Morant Bay Rebellion for some incident at a trial just 2 or so days before in Morant Bay, to which Bogle was attending. Those constables were apprehended in Stony Gut, and they were forced to swear to cleave from the white and cleave to the blacks. They were Bogle, and certainly the tradition to which he belonged to, felt that the unity of black persons was exceedingly important if they were to make any headway into terms of their own economic development, in terms of the principle of equality. One of the notions of freedom and justice emanating from the radical black tradition in Jamaica during that time was racial equality. That was a very, very big issue in Jamaica, and it certainly was a part of the philosophy of the Bogle movement and of the Morant Bay Rebellion. The issue of education, and a specific type of education, popular education generally, and an education also rooted in the philosophy of racial equality, in the philosophy of seeing and looking at the development of blacks around the not just during slavery, but before slavery, was a very important part of that philosophy. In fact, Menard wrote